Good. So we're going to move to our keynote speaker today. And I want to just say a couple words about him as we introduce him. And I'll just say, this was not by my design, but the two keynotes for this meeting are both from the University of Chicago. So I'm just going to shout out to my Midwestern friends and thank you for responding to our request to join this meeting. I'm going to introduce Dr. Chico Tillmon, who is somebody that I think we will all appreciate hearing from. He has some perspectives that he brings to the work of justice that are unique and valuable. Dr. Tillmon is a senior research fellow at the University of Chicago Crime and Education Lab and a violence prevention expert who serves on the leadership team of the Peace Consortium, the collaboration that runs Fund Peace. He's the former executive director of the YMCA of Metro Chicago's Youth Safety and Violence Prevention Programs, is a national consultant, training and technical assistance provider on violence prevention, reentry, and nonprofit organizations. Dr. Tillmon is a formerly incarcerated individual. He came back from his experience with the purpose of trying to change his community in a positive way. He works with youth, young adults, and direct service providers in marginalized areas to help them hone their professional skills and improve their work performance. He has worked for over a decade in violence prevention, mental health, and reentry. In 2021, Dr. Tillmon was recognized by President Biden for his national violence prevention work and was invited to the White House. He's a recipient of the 2018 Congressional Veterans Brain Trust Award and a 2017 Ford Men of Courage Award for his work in Chicago's most vulnerable communities. He was named the Practitioner of the Year in 2016 by the University of Illinois in Chicago Criminology Law and Justice Department. So, as I mentioned, Dr. Chico Tillmon has some perspective and some experience that I think we should all pay attention to. So, Dr. Tillmon, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be able to have the opportunity to speak on this platform to individuals that are immersed within the criminal justice or public safety sector and who go daily trying to solve this problem, not only of crime, but violent crimes throughout the United States. First and foremost, I would like to thank you for your service and your desire to make not only our country safe, but our community safe, and to bring health and healing to our community. One thing that wasn't in my bio that I would like to add, just to give you context, I'm an individual that was system impacted, but my stepfather was a police officer, a retired police officer from the Chicago Police Department. So I have this unique experience of someone who has entered the criminal justice system and seen what trauma has done in our most vulnerable communities, but understand the challenges that police officers go through daily, being in a relationship intimately with someone who day after day went out there to try to make their community and city safer. So I do have a unique perspective. Could you go to the first slide for me, please? I would like to say in 2021, we came up with a unique term called CVI, and it almost transitioned from what we call violence prevention, because violence prevention was so broad and utilized in so many different ways that in order to address this continuum of this violence in a way with a continuum of care, we narrowed the definition down to CVI, which includes these complementary strategies that address individuals typically at the highest risk. Now, one thing that CVI does is it's a strategy to identify individuals in particular areas over a particular time frame who are most likely to be either the perpetrator of violence, but also the victim of violence. Some of the strategies for CVI, of course, would be street outreach or street intervention, where individuals who are considered credible messengers. Credible messengers are individuals who live in particular communities, know the community, have an understanding of a community, but also receive intel of situations prior to it escalating to the point where crime or violence have been committed, and can intervene in those particular situations prior to law enforcement being needed to mediate a particular situation or resolve it. So let me start by saying CVI is a complementary strategy to law enforcement, not a replacement. It's not an adversarial relationship, but CVI works with individuals when law enforcement would be challenged working with individuals because no crime has been breached or broken, or no crime has been committed. Hypothetically, in situations where there's argument or tension between two individuals who have past histories of using aggressive behavior, but no crime has been committed, CVI will work in those particular spaces. And also in spaces in the hospital where individuals might be injured, they can work with the families, they can work with other groups, they can extend outreach for individuals in HVIP to receive services, and also around group violence intervention, which we call focused deterrence, where they work collaboratively with law enforcement in order to resolve or quell violence. Lastly, we look at wraparound services, which is wraparound services would be this continuum of care that individuals need after an incident or prior to an incident or after something has been mediated or resolved. The wraparound services deal with the root causes of violence. Why did this individual respond in this particular way to an incident that we would seem is somewhat irrational? In many cases, if you think about it, most of the violence that occurs throughout the United States, if you look at the data, is based upon not gangs, not some of the things that the media sensationalize, but interpersonal conflict and individuals not having the skill set to be able to resolve situations, peacefully. So what we do is not only connect individuals with people with cultural competency and cultural sensitivity that can reach and meet the individuals where they are, but also we connect individuals with the services, whether it's housing, whether it's educational services, whether it's employment services, to help this individual on a track or a pathway into a positive pro-social lifestyle. Could you go to the next slide, please? CVI typically focuses, as I said, on individuals at the highest risk. If you think about violence, and I try to use real practical examples that everybody can relate to, a great example would be, I often use is high school. Many of us, or almost everyone on the call, have had this experience in high school when two kids are about to fight. And everybody in the school, all the students are aware of the fight that's about to take place, except who? The teachers or the administration. It's the same in the community. In the community, when tension is high between two individuals or two groups, individuals within the community are aware or have the street intelligence of what is about to brew or what could potentially happen. Therefore, we train these individuals intensively in de-escalation and mediation, and also we connect them through referrals to different systems or networks within municipalities, counties, and cities to get these individuals services that'll deter them from using aggressive behavior. One of the things we use also, which one of my colleagues wrote so extensively about, Papa Christos from out of Yale, who currently is a professor at Northwestern, is social networking. We utilize data to identify these individuals, but also to create programs that are unique to the current violence in each particular community. For example, even though there are some commonalities of violence, it looks pretty different in different communities. The violence in Chicago or LA may look quite different from Montana or Utah or Seattle. So what we do is we go through a process, a research process that starts with problem analysis and ends with program design to design a program tailored exactly to the challenges that we're having in these particular communities. Could you go to the next slide? I hinted on this earlier. The purpose of the problem analysis, of course, will first be able to identify where the violence exists or what type of violence exists. Those are some of the questions that the problem analysis answers. Where it exists, how long has it existed, what are the trends, what are the populations, what are the type of crimes, so that we can be real specific when we design a program that fits the particular need of the violence or the crime that's happening in a particular community. The second thing we would do in this process would be asset mapping. The purpose of asset mapping is to see what programs or what assets already exist in a community so we're not duplicating services or programs that already exist. And if they already exist, what we would do is convene them and strengthen them so that they can address some of the challenges and we wouldn't have to replicate it. Thirdly, in this process, what we would do qualitative interviewing and focus groups. The purpose of that is to find the why. We would talk to the police department to get their perspective. We would talk to government officials. We would talk to residents. We would talk to other stakeholders within the community. We talk to business owners to get a deep understanding of why the violence or the crime is occurring in a particular community. Then, based upon those 3 points that I spoke about earlier, we'll look at the data and what emerges and build a program based upon those particular things to address those particular problems. We have frameworks, whether it be the public health approach, the ecological systems approach, whether it be focused deterrence. We have frameworks, but the program should be designed to meet or mitigate the problem that exists in a particular community, not a one-size-fits-all and bring a brand to a particular community without doing the first 3 steps. And then after that, what we would do is program implementation. The implementation looks like a TA provider working collaboratively with the city or with the agency that desires a program to build it out together. I think in some cases where we've seen some challenges is where the TA provider built out a program without the understanding or without the collaborative help of the particular city or community. And there was challenges because after it's built, the provider has to take over and have to run the program. So it's important that they have input, that they mold it and fashion it, that it's not rigid, but yet it's flexible to meet the needs of a particular city. Upon implementation, then we still need intensive training, technical assistance, and onboarding, because still, just because individuals are trained when shootings and homicides occur, they still need support because they don't yet have the experience on how to deal with it. So the TA provider usually walk them through these particular processes. Also, what's very important, and one of the gaps we've seen in CVI is data collection. So we help them with a research design embedded throughout the program, but also show them which data points need to be collected and how to collect it, and what's the preferable case managed and data management systems which are user-friendly and allow them to collect the data that's needed in order to identify the impact they're having in a particular community. Lastly, training. You want to continue with ongoing TA and training in order to ensure that the staff is up to date with things as they change and with things that go on during this process. Also, ongoing TA so that the TA providers that are rich in experience can come in and support these individuals on the ground that are, in many cases, first responders responding to violent situations without any weapons, and that's critical. And they're exposed to tremendous amount of trauma. So also some of the things that the TA does is help them develop coping mechanisms to deal with this day-to-day exposure to vicarious trauma. The next slide, please. When you think about working in communities where there's high rates of violence, whether it be in a major city or a small community, you think about this exposure to trauma. And if you think about it, the people on this call know it too well, especially the people in law enforcement, because you're constantly exposed to tragic situations, whether a crime has been committed and someone has been victimized, whether their property has been damaged, whether an individual has suffered a fatality. You're constantly being exposed to fatality. In the same breath or in the same lane, individuals working in CVI are constantly being exposed to trauma. They actually are exposed even more to complex trauma because not only do they deal with these situations daily, but in many cases, they live in these communities where shootings are taking place daily. For example, individuals in Chicago who live in communities like Austin, Inglewood, or North Lawndale, last year there were 800 homicides and 4,000 shootings. So individuals who work in these communities were not only exposed to the trauma of going to work, dealing with victims, but also dealing with perpetrators, potential perpetrators, but also living in these communities where it happens daily. SAMHSA said some interesting things when they went over the principle of trauma-informed care, which is very critical and somewhat challenging in CVI. The challenge in CVI with administering trauma-informed care is the first principle is safety. The challenge with that is that safety only exists for a small amount of time. Even in a place-based approach, the challenge is individuals entering into this safe space, but yet have to return to a place where they were traumatized or triggered. So we're still learning, exploring ways to mitigate this unfortunate situation. It would be the same as individuals who are in war zones who come to receive some type of treatment for being traumatized, but yet going back to the war zone right after they leave treatment. Those are some of the challenges that individuals, even who administer CVI, face in this particular sector. Another thing is another principle would be trustworthiness and transparency. The key to that is we try to hire individuals with established relationships and ties already in the community, and that allows immediate buy-in and allow us to be able to unpack or deal with situations that can potentially be very sensitive. Sensitive meaning it might breach or be close to the line where it could potentially be a crime, or a person may have the right to press charges in some situations, but they have an opportunity to talk to someone about potential situations, and we are able to resolve it prior to it resulting to violence. In addition, one of the principles is peer support, and when you think about it, CVI does several things. CVI impacts the recidivism because it often uses individuals that have been justice impact. So the first individual that's desisting from crime or going through this cognitive behavioral intervention are the employees, because in order for them to render services, they have to buy into this process in order to render the services. And then they're able to not only relate to individuals in our most vulnerable communities, but also share their lived experience and their transformation with these individuals to give them a pathway to a pro-social lifestyle. The fourth point, which would be collaboration, I think is critical that everyone within the ecosystem begin to unify, carry the burden of violence. I think one of the challenges, not only in CVI, but law enforcement, is that too often CVI or law enforcement have been given the burden of violence in the community to carry alone or to resolve alone. And what we've learned is that we can't do it by ourselves. CVI can't solve the violence problem by itself, law enforcement. We have to do it together. And that's why we look at scientific approaches, and we were able to learn so much through this ecological systems approach or public health approach during what we had with COVID, is that the way we were able to address this public health crisis was that we all complied and worked together in a collaborative way. And we all knew that we needed different people in different sectors to work together in order to mitigate this public health crisis. And we have to do the same thing when we look at violence. We have to work together, not necessarily in a way that shares information or work along where we work, but we have to respect each other's lane and know each other's part. It would be the same, a good example would be a football team. The football team can't be successful if the linemen don't block, but the linemen do something quite different from the quarterback, and the quarterback does something different from the receivers, or they do something different from the running back. But the only way they can be successful if they collaboratively work together. And that would be the same way we have to address violence. We have to address it together. Another principle of CVI or in trauma-informed care would be empowerment, voice, and choice. And that's really giving individuals at the highest risk an opportunity to choose a pro-social lifestyle and asking them what they need in order to transition from this subculture lifestyle that some of it has been imposed by systematic disinvestment over centuries. And lastly, trauma-informed care involves, according to SAMHSA, cultural, historical, and gender issues, which we know are critical when dealing with individuals who are at the highest risk of being both perpetrators and victims of violence. The next slide, please. In many cases, people ask, like, how does CVI work? And CVI really is based upon, if you could ask me what's the nuts and bolts or the meat of CVI, the first thing I would say relies on relationships and the people that's hired with lived experience. That's the most important element of CVI. Not so much in management, but the direct service providers. The direct service providers have to have lived experience or be embedded and from the community in which they work. That's the most important thing, because that's the only way we're able to get intel or information about situations prior to it escalating the violence. Individuals have to be immersed in the community, know the community, and have influence or let me say that clearly. Positive influence in the community where they can speak to individuals about situations. And a lot of people don't recognize most of the work that's done in CVI with these credible messengers is done prior to an event. Canvassing, going out, getting data from police departments about where are particular hot spots, where are target areas, where violence has frequently occurred. Staying on top of data, that's critical, so that we can frequent them areas and find out what's going on so we can get in front of it. The most important thing about CVI is getting in front of the situation. I want to be clear about that prior to it escalating to a crime being committed. One of the deep challenges is that we got to increase the professionalism. That would be the gap in CVI. We've relied so heavy on lived experience and relationship in the community that we've seen a dip or a challenge in terms of skill sets. So we have to do a better job of build professional development for individual in CVI, but also we have to have an opportunity for upward mobility. In some cities, there's individuals that's been working in CVI for 15 and 20 years as an outreach worker, because there's really no upward mobility. So what we're really moving toward is an opportunity for these individuals that's developed this expertise in mediation, de-escalation, mental health, trauma-informed care, to be able to take those skills into different disciplines or professions. Because in many professions where they respond to trauma situations, some of these skills that's gathered or garnered by these individuals can be utilized in those particular professions to support those people. Another challenge would be, it's been limited research. There's been limited research done in CVI. So by it being a young field, most of the work being done would be evidence generating or evidence informed as opposed to evidence based. Most of it is evidence generating and evidence informed. One of the similarities, and I spoke about it a little bit earlier, to CVI and law enforcement is this heavy exposure to traumatic events. And I think there's a commonality to CVI workers and law enforcement is that they're dealing with violence on a daily basis and being constantly in situations where they're exposed to trauma. And one of the things we noticed is that, and I talked to my colleague, Sean Malinowski, who's going to speak tomorrow, Dr. Malinowski. We have to think of creative ways to support people who deal with a situation and before they have an opportunity to process it or go from outbursts or this traumatic phase back down the baseline to be able to process it and deal with what and heal from that situation before them going right into the next situation. And that's one of the ways we got to think about not only supporting CVI, but law enforcement as well. And that's one of the biggest challenges when I speak to law enforcement is I talk to them about from a space of understanding, like we got to do a better job supporting law enforcement who often have to deal with a robbery and then right after robbery, deal with another high impact situation that's violent. And they really never have an opportunity to process what just happened. And in many cases, their life could have been in danger. So they're going into the next situation without an opportunity, without an interval to be able to process what they went through. Could you please go to the next slide? When you think about CVI and law enforcement, one of the challenges of CVI too is that CVI has no security. So you have individuals who respond to violence day after day, and their job is connected to a grant, which is ridiculous. These people put their lives on the line every day, talking to individuals at the highest risk. In the city of Baltimore, just to give you some context, 3 individuals working in CVI were murdered this year, over the last year, in an attempt to resolve conflict. 3 individuals was murdered. Talking to individuals, because in many cases, one of the things individuals working CVI encounter is individuals that are challenged with substance use disorder. So they might talk to an individual that are under a substance, and the individual might respond spontaneously. And in those 3 cases, there were fatalities in Baltimore. So we have to look at a way of allowing this to be a permanent part of a public safety plan. And it's unfair to law enforcement to ask law enforcement to do everything. I think that's one of the biggest challenges in public safety is that in many cases we ask law enforcement to do and be everything. And that's unfair, as opposed to dealing with individuals who commit crime or where crime is present in this narrow scope. Therefore, CVI, if you really look at the ecosystem, CVI and law enforcement are both co-laborers who have a desire and design and objective to keep the community safe. They just use two different approaches. But in the end, they're both designed or have a desire to keep the community safe. And even if you think about some of the challenges that law enforcement went through over the last 24 months with the uprisings and everything, I do believe CVI workers can be a liaison to start the healing process between law enforcement and community. Because I think the only challenge in America is sometimes we use labeling. It's a theory called labeling, and we dehumanize different populations by associating them with their profession and not getting to the basic concept that in the end we all are humans. And policing is a profession, CVI is a profession, but at the end of the day, we're two people that have the desired same need. And I think we have to coexist. I think it has to be based upon mutual trust and respect both ways. I think it's important that police officers begin to understand what CVI workers do. And I think there has to be a space for CVI and policing to come together to be able to discuss some of the challenges they have. And then they'll be able to understand the commonality that they have in both moving towards situations when other people will run from them situations in order to keep our community safe. Despite the distinction of the roles, they both move toward volatile and violent situations to keep others in the community safe, and they deal with individuals that are at the highest risk on a daily basis. Lastly, I want to say we have to make CVI a permanent part of the public safety plan. I'm excited about what the new administration is doing and being intentional about creating opportunities for CVI to be a permanent part of the plan, of this public safety plan, so that we can begin to share the burden of violence across the entire ecosystem and solve it together. Now, I would love to see if anybody have any questions.
So we have 3 questions that came in from Cynthia. Is there a peer-reviewed eval on this CVI program that you can send to me?
Yes, it's several evals that I could send, and I'll make sure I send it to you, Amanda. Recently, I transitioned, and I still have my fellowship at the University of Chicago, but I started working at READI at Heartland Alliance, and they were one of the organizations that actually did a RC, a randomized control. So I definitely can send that to you and other evaluations around CVI.
Thank you. The next question is from Terry. Often police agencies are faulted for developing lists or names of those who are at risk to be victims or offenders. The intentions are to intervene and to help. What is the best practice to achieve an honorable goal and avoid negative interferences?
I think 2 things. I think messaging is critical. Messaging and building relationships. One of the things I seen unique. I want us to think about this. New York and LA are the largest 2 cities in America. In the 90s, New York and LA were at about 1,200 homicides a year. Now, New York and LA are 2 of the safest cities in America, hovering around. New York hovers around 200 homicides, and LA around 300. And you might say, well, that's still a lot. Well, in comparison, Chicago got 800 compared to those 2. So they've made a dramatic decline. And one of the ways they've done it is by CVI and police working collaboratively and having great relationships, doing things together. And people seeing these individuals that's credible having a great relationship with police. It's not an adversarial relationship. Them doing community events together. It's ways to do things to show that it's not adverse just between police and community. And when you begin to do things like that and then share information, you can share it in a way where it can be productive, especially in those particular settings. And typically what happens is police officers don't meet with individuals that's doing direct services. They typically would meet with the administration, whether it's the executive director or directors, or they would be meeting with the program manager and talking about potential people who they may want to contact or individuals they might want to start having conversations with. But they wouldn't be meeting daily with individuals who are doing a direct service.
Thank you for that. The next question is from Joe. How do CVI workers address the no snitching culture so dominant in at-risk communities today?
That's an interesting question. First, I think, first of all, I think people have a misconception of what snitching is. And me being an individual that's from a vulnerable community, let me start by defining it. Snitching is when an individual is involved in a crime with another individual, and an individual comes forward to tell law enforcement about the other individual to receive a more lenient sentence. In a real live form, that's what snitching is. When an individual is involved in a crime and they come forward in order to receive some type of leniency and puts the blame on somebody else or talks about what another person does. The challenge, let's talk about the nuances or the challenges in vulnerable communities. In vulnerable communities, people aren't as open about things that happen in the community because historically, when people have come forth, because of the limited capacity of law enforcement, they haven't had the opportunity to protect people that come forth and talk about situations that happen. In terms of CVI, CVI doesn't promote individuals going to law enforcement about particular situations, but neither do they protect or hide information or talk about the criminalizing part about situations. Our job is to prevent individuals from using violence in an aggressive manner. We're not investigating situations to find out exactly what happened. Our focus is, what will it take for this situation not to happen or not to continue, as opposed to getting into all the details about what happened. Because the challenge with trying to investigate a particular situation would then endanger the individual that's gathering the information. So we don't train individuals in CVI to investigate situations because that potentially puts them in a vulnerable situation. We train individuals in CVI to mitigate, mediate, and de-escalate particular situations without going into deep detail about everything that's happened. Another reason we don't go into deep detail about what happened, because we have to use objectivity. If you tell me the details about a situation, then my bias can impede me mediating the situation because it impacts my value system. Hypothetically, if you say, well, this guy did something to my son, that's why I'm responding this way, immediately a part of my brain say, how would I respond if somebody did something to my son? And it's not, I don't want to be in a position to validate anybody doing anything violent. So I try and stay away from the particulars and move directly to situations of how I can resolve the situation.
Anyone have any other questions? We still have some time left.
I have a quick question, Amada, actually. First of all, Dr. Tillmon, let me thank you for your presentation, but for your response to these questions. Those are some of the best responses I've heard from anybody. So thank you for that. I'm interested in your use of the word ecosystem. I think some of us, many of us, will have a general understanding about what that means, but it's kind of a new term that's worked its way into our work. So could you just talk for a minute about what that means to you and your work when you talk about the ecosystem?
Yeah. In order to really mitigate violence, if we think about from a community perspective, or we think about in a city, we need the help of, first of all, CVI. We need the help of law enforcement. We need the help of government. We need the help of the state's attorney or the city's attorney department. We need the help of the hospital VIP. We need the help of different networks, whether it be housing, and all the different sectors or all the different departments or entities within this whole entire ecosystem would be this whole entire city that makes it function, play a role in bringing down the violence. Because typically when you get to the root cause of a situation, it may be something that could easily be resolved with sending them to a mental health provider, with sending them to a place where they can get housing. The whole incident may be over a situation that can be resolved through anger management. So you need access to these different resources in order to resolve situations, because despite how we try to generalize violence, each incident looks different, or the root cause of it might be very different, and access to all these different agencies and components, and even something as business owners. What you say, Chico, what do they have to do with violence? By creating opportunities for employment. Like right now, I'm working at READI, and one of the things, READI stands for Rapid Employment and Develop Initiative. At READI Chicago, we offer employment and CBT, or CVI, cognitive behavior intervention. So we need an opportunity or a pathway for these individuals to have a pro-social lifestyle. So that's when I say ecosystem, I'm talking about everybody within the city, by us all acknowledging that violence is all of our problems, that all of us can contribute in the way that we contribute to society. So we're not asking people to do anything outside of what they already do, but utilize or leverage their influence or their services to help us mitigate violence together.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Anybody else have any questions for Dr. Tillmon? All right. Dr. Tillmon, thank you again very much for responding to our invitation to have you speak, and for speaking the way you did and preparing the way that you did for this meeting. Very beneficial for us. Go ahead.
I want to say something lastly. All the departments receive not only ARPA funding, but their throughout the DOJ and the CDC is both going to have $100 million in their budgets this year for CVI. And some of it is going to be for law enforcement. So there's a lot of funding coming down the pipeline. There's a lot of opportunity. And it's critical that we be open-minded about thinking of creative, innovative ways to address challenges within our community. Lastly, I'll say this. I spoke a lot about Chicago, New York, LA, but some of my work was done in Austin, Texas. Austin, Texas violence looks totally different from the other two cities. Austin violence emerged or spiked because of the housing boom caused individuals to lose their houses and created encampments where people have tents along the highway and along the streets. And because you created this space where there's a lot of poverty, individuals' violence spiked. Secondly, they have a challenge with sex professions and immigration. Because of individuals' lack of access to pro-social lifestyle, positive employment, and a pathway into mainstream society, they developed the underground current, and there's been a lot of violence through the sex trafficking and sex profession trade. That particular challenge looked quite different from those other cities, but we have to be creative and innovative with all of this funding coming to think about ways to address the challenges in our particular cities. And I wanted to say that because you may say, Dr. Chico, my violence doesn't look like Chicago, New York, or LA, but your situation, but the funding coming down allows you to have the innovation to be able to create something that addresses or mitigate the violence that persists in your particular community. Thank you.
Couldn't have said it better myself, sir. Thank you so very much. Let's take this moment to just take a break before the next session. Again, I'd like to extend my thanks to Dr. Tillmon for his presentation for us today and for his talk about CVI, which, as he said, is an administration priority. So we'll be hearing more about that. I think Chris sent out a message, but can we all just report back to our cameras in about 9 minutes for the next session, which will be as engaging as this one. We're going to hear from some SPI sites on their experiences in implementing their projects. So once again, much thanks to Dr. Tillmon. Let's take a break and come back in a few minutes. Thanks, everybody.